Hey everyone, Happy New Year, and we want to say Happy New Year and welcome to the very first Radiotopia Presents of 2024. It's a series that we are truly excited about. It's called Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. Now, this is from documentarian Jess Shane, who put out an open call on Craigslist and then worked with 4 strangers to explore the standard rules that documentarians and journalists use to tell their subject stories. So the series gets into all sorts of questions about what happens when people's real lives are collected, edited, and consumed. The show pulls back the curtain on what goes on behind the scenes of your favorite nonfiction shows. And then it turns in on itself and some really interesting twists and turns along the way in the making of the show. I've gotten to know Jess a little bit over the making of this show. Every time I chat with her, there's a new wrinkle to this story. It is really incredible. So go check out the new Radiotopia Presents series, Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. It is out now on your favorite podcast platform. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avergan. This day, June 15th, 1970, an episode of the documentary series Masters Without Masks aired on Russian television. The documentary series was the work of a Soviet journalist, Valentin Zorin, who for decades, basically the entire second half of the 20th century, traveled the United States and reported on life in America for viewers back in Russia. And I think it's safe to say he was one of the main forces, if not the main force, shaping the way that Russians thought about the United States. One of the reasons I feel safe to say that is because that is in many ways the argument of a new episode of Jill Lepore's excellent podcast, The Last Archive. There's a new episode all about Zorin, his reporting in America, his mix of documentary and propaganda, and lots more. And Jill Lepore is our special guest for this episode. So Jill, thank you for doing this. We've been trying to have you on the show for a while.
Hey, thanks so much for having me.
And of course, that podcast, The Last Archive, you may know Jill's work in The New Yorker, her many excellent books. The new book is If Then, one of our favorite historians. And also joined today, as always, by 2 of my other favorite historians, Nicole Hemmer of Columbia and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
All right, so let's talk about Zorin. And Jill, this episode, like a lot of the episodes of your series, goes in all sorts of really interesting, sweeping directions. But let's put a pin in this moment, 1970. Who is Zorin at this time? And kind of paint a picture of his influence within Russia. You call him the Soviet Union's most well-known Americanist. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so Zorin sometimes was referred to as the Walter Cronkite of the Soviet Union. He was a serious newscaster and reporter. He anchored the equivalent of a kind of Meet the Press program. But he also was a roving journalist, not just sort of a desk bunny, right? So he traveled all over the country at a time when, of course, not a lot of Soviets were able to enter the United States or travel freely around the United States. So he's sort of the leading foreign correspondent. And he's also a historian, as Nicole and Kellie and I could talk about, which is kind of fascinating to me. He has a doctorate in history, and his expertise basically is an Americanist. At a time, kind of the rise of American studies, he's the Russian American studies scholar. But he's also a propagandist, because most of what the Soviet Academy is directed toward with regard to its interest in the U.S. Is denigrating capitalism and calling attention to the hypocrisies and contradictions of the American state and American civil society. So he's a lot of things that are kind of hard for us to hold together in our minds, because on the one hand, he seems to be Walter Cronkite, but on the other hand, he's sort of Borat. And that's, you know what I mean? Like, so it's kind of confusing. So what I loved about this story, which is, I'm so excited to be on your podcast because this really is esoteric political history. I had never, this is pitch perfect. I had never heard of Zorin, but my brilliant editor, Julia Barton on The Last Archive, was kind of obsessed with him. And she brought this story to me, and it somehow filled in a big hole that I didn't even know was kind of a hole in my understanding of the history of propaganda.
Yeah, I mean, he's a fascinating character because he also has an incredible amount of access. I mean, Borat is interviewing people like Rudy Giuliani and members of the House of Representatives, but Zorin is sitting down with John and Robert Kennedy, with Henry Kissinger. He's someone who really is rubbing elbows with not just the elite, but, the president of the United States. So he must have been taken seriously as a journalist in addition to being a propagandist.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can see some of those interviews you can still see on YouTube. I think the one where he interviews Reagan. Yeah. Just before Reagan travels to the Soviet Union on that first trip that he takes. He's a very, very serious guy. On the other hand, he was trained in the school of Soviet propaganda where in the 1950s, when he was getting his education, he was taught that, FDR had not died of natural causes, that he had been assassinated. And a big impetus of Zorin's own research is dedicated to attempting to prove that Lee Harvey Oswald was not the lone gunman, right? Like he's kind of the Soviet version of the anti-Warren Commission report. He has a whole conspiracy theory about Kennedy that involves an oil oligarchy of Texas oil men that is so out of the movies that it later becomes a movie. Which is just the zaniness of this is kind of great. But on the other hand, one of the pieces of footage from the series of films that he makes is Masters Without Masks, which are films that are made in the early 1970s. Each is about a different city. He really does doggedly report on white supremacy in the U.S. in a way that is not being reported by what we would now call the mainstream press, but broadcast news or major newspapers. He goes and interviews, the head of the KKK. And this interview it'd be kind of fascinating to me, like, why does the head of the KKK want to sit down with the Soviet Walter Cronkite? But, so much of what the Soviet propaganda is interested in doing is exposing not a lie, but the truth of white supremacy, the truth of the racial regime that is still in place in the United States, that in the era when Zorin is doing all this work is just not part of the coverage. By the 70s, right? Sort of when I think broadcasters like NBC, ABC, they kind of want to put the unrest of the 1960s behind as, the unrest of the 1960s, and as if like that kind of period ended. And Zorin's doing something really different.
It's funny to me because, like, just hearing about who this person is. First, he's also, we should say, being followed by the government the entire time. So it's not like he's just sort of like roaming the country, without supervision. But then also the ideas that he has about trying to get at the heart of, America's like nefarious plots, and comes up with like, and it's so funny because when I was listening to the podcast and he's talking about like sort of trying to get at the heart of this, I was like, oh, that's got to be white supremacy. That's got to be black people. And then the next line is like, so he realizes that civil rights. And I was like, totally. But also this idea of conspiracies and how you mentioned as well, like if you weren't a historian, you might be a conspiracy theorist. And that was pretty hilarious. But like, there are a lot of ideas swirling in this moment, and it is sort of difficult to tease out what is, people's intentions, the government's intentions and motivations and all of these things that are happening in this, larger conversation about America and Russian relations.
And importantly, there's this weakness, not just in American politics, white supremacy, lack of civil rights, that he exploits, but as you were mentioning, a weakness in American media. There was this hole that needed to be filled, even in this moment when, you're starting to get journalists who are being more adversarial after a period of real deference to people in power. There's still plenty of space, plenty of questions that aren't being asked, plenty of dark places that aren't finding the light of journalism on them. And so there are these real weaknesses in the American system that he exposes because not all American journalists are really doing their job.
Yeah, but there's also one of the things that it was made visible to me in a new way, or I guess I should say made audible to me in a new way, is the counterpoint to Zorin from the left criticizing the U.S., which is the American right, and its really slowly emerging alternative media, right? So this Texas guy, tycoon H.L. Hunt, that Zorin is obsessed with and thinks is behind the Kennedy assassination and everything else in the U.S. that he disagrees with, Hunt is a propagandist too, right? He has this radio show. He funds all these radio network stuff. He has this thing called the Facts Forum, where he's just basically a John Bircher who has a radio audience at a time when it's not breaking through the way, say, Rush Limbaugh would come to break through, right, and then become the dominant voice on the radio and on a whole band of the radio. But you like listening to the Hunt broadcasts from the late 60s, early 70s. It's just like the kind of counterpoint against Zorin is really fascinating. And what they're both pressing against is what they're trying to break down the wall of this, broadcast media, the kind of mainstream media.
But Zorin is talking to an audience mostly back in the USSR. So can you give us a sense of how powerful his voice was and how, I guess, limited a view he provided? Were there other you can argue in the United States, at least, that maybe there were other competing voices that there was a larger ecosystem of stories being told about ourselves that Hunt was a part of. In the USSR, was Zorin the only one kind of providing stories about the U.S.?
Yeah, basically he really was. I mean, it's state-sanctioned television. There is no set of other voices. There is no dissent. And what is sanctioned about what he is doing is that every time he goes to an American city and profiles the city, and we see the beautiful gleaming skyscrapers and the roads and the cars and the sexy rock and roll dancing, then he tours the tenement neighborhoods, then he tours the public facilities that are decayed, and he looks at trash in parks, and we see the hard lives of the poor and the exploited workers, and we see the racial inequality, and we see immigrants being, attacked. So everything that Zorin does is very much on message with what the Soviet state wants to have known about the U.S. But this is when the rise of social history is taking off in the U.S. and in the Academy, historians are really carefully beginning to attend to this, to these other worlds that are sort of have been kind of left out of American historical scholarship to a large part before the 1970s. But in this episode of the podcast, I watched a bunch of the Zorin films with a colleague of mine, Sergei Plokin, who grew up in Ukraine. And so he did sort of live translation for me as we were watching them together, because he had watched them as a kid, and it's why he became a scholar. It's why he became a historian. And he was really fun to watch with, but also what he made clear was that, what was on TV was supposed to show you something, but you could see something different, right? That's propaganda isn't really, there's not like masterful control over how you watch that. He's like, I just remember thinking, wow, the cars are so cool, and I want some of those jeans. Like how really Zorin was the only game in town showing you America, but the footage was incredible. Right. So I think like for Sergei, he really made clear to me that people watching Zorin, they knew what the state was trying to tell them about the U.S. Right. And they kind of just blew a raspberry at it and said, yeah, but look at the roads. Right. I mean, you can drive in this place. Like, we don't even have roads.
Yeah, it's kind of a double-edged sword in that sense, in that it's meant to sort of turn people off against the United States. And in some ways, it's really seductive in getting people to say, like, look at what they've got.
Yeah. Exactly.
And you also make a really good point that the power of television in Russia, especially such a big country with so many time zones, it's hard to overstate kind of how important television was as a unifying force. So as I was listening to this episode, I was trying to think, what is the modern analog to this? Or what is an analog to this? And I was like, well, it's not really de Tocqueville. And I think you do a good job of not saying de Tocqueville during this episode. But then I was like, I think it's Sacha Baron Cohen. And so I was so happy to hear you at the end of the episode go there and actually make that connection, because that's exactly where my head was too. And I will actually draw a distinction between Borat and Sacha Baron Cohen, maybe, because I think Sacha Baron Cohen is the one who's the kind of journalistic, cultural observer using Borat as a character to do this similar work. Which is all to say, I'm curious what your thoughts are on the power of just an outside observer. I mean, and the power of someone coming in and observing our country. And I think and whether there's still a role for that today, and whether we listen to those voices enough in this country.
I'm trying to think of whether I think Sacha Baron Cohen is a good analog, because at the end of the day, there's nothing subtle going on there, right? Mm-hmm. Like, it is an indictment of right. the American politics of the right. And that's like all that it is. It's not, there's a certain kind of, I think, affection about America that's in those films, but it has a somewhat similar quality to Borat in that way. Whereas I think the true foreign correspondent that you want to hear from doesn't have the interests of her own nation state at heart in deciding what to report on, right? The true foreign correspondent is genuinely interested in the country and what's going on there. And there's, of course, tremendous reporting, but it doesn't have Sacha Baron Cohen has just such a clear agenda with what he's doing. And, and Zorin had such obviously agenda, and he had no choice in having that agenda, right? Like he's acting as part of an oppressive regime, and he's an instrument and a tool of that regime. Let's be completely clear about what's going on. He may have really loved the United States. He's not going to be able to do that in his reporting. I do think there's for sure a place for outside observers, but I'm not sure myself that I see where that voice is quite now. I mean, I think the larger trajectory of the episode is, as I think is kind of, the way, and you guys tell me if I'm overstepping here, that I think the way many American political historians think about the end of the Cold War is that this kind of Manichaean battle between the free world and the communist world got just kind of like in the U.S. everything turned on itself, right? Like in the 90s when people on the right said, "Oh no, the Cold War is not over. Now we just get to attack liberals." Like it like the kind of by any means necessary political warfare that we see beginning in the 1990s with the emergence of that culture war really is the tactics of the Cold War turned inward, and that's what I was for me. That's why Zorin seemed so powerful. It's not about, and maybe I'm disagreeing with a little bit here, Jody. So I didn't walk away thinking, wow, we really need the insight of an outside observer to indict our society. More like, well, that's all we do, right? Like that's how our politics works. We just hate each other so much that there's nothing redemptive about the other side, about the other tribe within the U.S.
That starts to get at something that I think you build towards in this episode. And frankly, much of your series kind of builds towards this question of propaganda and truth. And, I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about the evolution between propaganda that has a bit of an agenda, maybe that we can characterize Zorin in that way, to what seems to be now just a propaganda that the end goal is to destabilize and to sort of make us question basic truths. And you start to track that a little bit in there. But if Zorin existed now and was still an agent of the state, would he be less making an argument and more just trying to kind of like fracture and disrupt?
Yeah, I mean, the episode is called The Children of Zorin for a reason. And I say at the end, like, we're all the children of Zorin, that somehow where, during the height of the Cold War, it was okay in the U.S. to really, really hate communists, like to really hate them, to just hate them. I mean, people's lives were upended during various Red Scares in this country. Like the viciousness, the brutality of that hatred was fully authorized by the state and by the culture, right? And now I think within our partisan divisions, it's actually fully authorized by the parties to completely hate and consider as inadmissible as any possibility of holding any truth whatsoever would be the position of your political opponents. So it's that same kind of fervor to it. But then, as you say, Jody, there is a kind of diffused sense of also at the end of the day, who really knows anymore anything? And in the course of the series, I really trace that to the 1930s and what American journalists called the Nazi strategy of terror. The strategy of terror was what we would now call perception hack, right? You don't need to prove that there are a lot of, secret Nazis in France. You just need to say it enough to convince the French that once you invade, half the population is going to take the side of the Germans. And then you've won before you've even rolled a tank over the border. That's what the Russians have been doing with our elections. That's now, that's what Trump has done with the 2020 election, right? Like, you don't need to prove anything. Like, if you just say it enough, it works because the structures of intellectual authority have been so fully dismantled by various technological disruptions and kinds of political equilibrium over the last 20 years or so.
And even when you prove it, it still does not win people to your cause. That's the other thing.
Right.
Proof doesn't even matter.
Just right. So the courts can say it. All the governors and secretaries States can say it. All the nation's political scientists and law professors can say it. All the leading, newspapers and television news broadcasts can say it. And you can still think it's just all a lie. And that, it took a lot to develop the set of tools and strategies, both persuasive in terms of rhetorically persuasive in terms of how the propaganda works, and the technology. But it didn't start, in 2006 when Facebook launched its news feed. Really started in the 1930s.
And Zorin embodies it too in this sort of I'm just asking questions, kind of approach.
People are saying,
which is all, it's the only sort of discourse we seem to have right now is just I'm just asking a question. But, you do that enough, it rewires your brain.
Yeah, I think that's an important shift that you're focusing on as well, which is, when you talk about the Nazi strategy of terror, it's outsiders doing this to France, right? And the shift becoming that it's us doing it to ourselves, that it's Americans using the propaganda against Americans instead of these kind of nefarious outsiders.
Yeah, I mean, how do you understand that, Nicole? Is there a way to turn that back, or is that a misdiagnosis, or solve the whole problem of the world for us right now? We have
90 seconds before the show
right
episode ends.
We'll take care of it. Yeah.
So I don't think that it's, as you were pointing out, I don't think it's a new thing. H.L. Hunt was part of an entire network of people on the right who were figuring out these same styles of propaganda and rhetoric that have only grown in the decades since, accelerated by new innovations in media, but not started or caused by new innovations in media. I think it's a really thorny problem to unwind, though, because as we've seen, it comes with a lot of political upsides for the people who are using it, right? It's accreted a lot of power and a lot of money to people who use it. And as long as those incentives are in place, it's really difficult to at least get people to willingly give it up. Finding ways to shut it down. Otherwise, I think that has to be where the solution lies, because sort of convincing people to lay down their weapons does not seem to be a very effective approach.
Yeah, and the discouraging thing for me is, think about the last year. Of the things that could conceivably have, so there was an insurrection, the U.S. Capitol. There have been mass protests here and around the world about racial justice. There has been a global pandemic and an attendant financial crisis. You'd think that crisis would lead people who are benefiting from this kind of crap to just say, you know what, at the end of the day, I really do care about my fellow humans more than I care about my narrow political interests. So I'm going to stand up and say, yes, there was an insurrection. No, the election wasn't stolen. Yes, coronavirus is real. Yes, racism still exists. Like that people would say, if these things didn't lead to that outcome, what would?
Yeah, you have to think about the incentives, as Niki was saying, right? And the political incentives need to shift in some way.
And you can't expect an exogenous event to come along and do it, because we had all of the exogenous events that you could possibly have.
Right. I guess, tanks could roll into Washington, but that's the last thing.
Well,
something to look forward to in 2021.
So as we start to wrap up, I want to bring it a little back to Zorin, and I'm just curious, you hinted at it a little bit here, and in the episode you sort of get at it, but, I think Zorin represented a genuine curiosity, now curiosity with an agenda, sure, from, Russia in terms of what American life was. Did that flow in the other direction at all? Were Americans as interested in Russian life as Russians seemed to be in American life, and was there a Zorin of the U.S. who was traveling Russia?
There was an unbelievable fascination with the Soviet Union, and particularly with Russia. I really bonded with Julia Barton, our story editor, over this, because we grew up obsessed with Russia. Because when I was a kid, every social studies class, you'd have a unit on Russia and a unit on communism. And when I went to college, everybody was taking Russian classes. And then suddenly the Cold War ended, and all your taxi drivers were Americans with PhDs in Russian studies who had no jobs. Because suddenly, somehow, you shouldn't bother. But there was, this was a huge piece of détente in the 1970s, that mutual understanding alone could save us from atomic apocalypse. And there was something to that, right? Like actually realizing that we're all human beings. And also I think you could credit the environmental movement and a new sense of a shared humanity in the face of much bigger challenges than ideology. And there was the Olympics.
Yeah.
I mean, for me as a kid, it was all about the ice hockey.
Well, and I was going to bring that up because, and this is one of the lenses through which I look at stuff, but certainly sports, I think, flowed in both directions. But I think a lot of, Americans saw Russia through the lens of sports competition. And, we were sending teams over from the 40s through the 90s to do these tours. And maybe the Atlanta Hawks were our Zorin. They were the ones who were sort of going over and observing in some sort of way. All right, well, let's bring it to an end there. And one more shout out for Julia Barton. We're all big fans of hers. And I will point out that Julia did a really wonderful series about Russia and Russian propaganda and TV and satellites for this network, Radiotopia. It's called Space Bridge. Go check it out. And I will remind you that we can only do that kind of work because of support from our listeners. It's the fundraiser. You always have to be pledging, Jill. It's very important to keep that in mind.
Yeah.
But anyway, no, check out Julia's work. And of course, check out Jill Lepore's series, The Last Archive. Thank you so much for doing this.
Oh, thanks so much. I'm really glad to be a part of Esoteric Political History, and also really honored to be on with you guys as well,
Great.
Kellie and Nicole. So thanks again.
Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
This Day in Esoteric Political History is a proud member of Radiotopia from PRX, a network of independent, listener-supported, artist-owned podcasts. And we are, of course, in the middle of our spring fundraiser for Radiotopia. Thank you to everyone who has donated. For those of you waiting to become members, now is the time. Go ahead and become a recurring member and let us know, and we will let you see the big list of ideas that we use to put together this show each and every week. But really, thank you to everyone who has become a member or helped support this show in whatever way you can. Our researcher and producer is Jacob Feldman. Our producer is Brittany Brown. You can get in touch with any questions or comments or ideas for the show. Email us thisdaypod@gmail.com. You can also find a forum at thisdaypod.com where you can find out lots more information about the show. My name is Jody Avirgan. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you soon.
Radiotopia.